The crowd inside the brightly lit studio erupted into laughter. The host, a well-known liberal commentator with a sharp tongue and a smirk that never quite left his face, leaned forward, basking in the energy of his audience. "Trump supporters," he said, dragging out the words as if he could barely contain his amusement, "are the only people in history who worship a billionaire who wouldn't even let them set foot in his hotels." More laughter. Some even clapped. The segment had been scripted for maximum impact, mockery disguised as clever analysis, the kind that played well in viral clips, shared by millions who believed the same thing. Trump supporters were foolish, naive, and embarrassingly devoted to a man who, in their eyes, didn't deserve it. The host grinned, tapping his desk as if delivering the final punchline. "I mean, come on. A guy who paints himself as the champion of the working class while living in a gold-plated penthouse. How does that even make sense?" He leaned back in his chair, smug, victorious. The camera panned across the audience, smirks, headshakes, knowing glances exchanged like a private joke. They weren't just laughing at Trump, they were laughing at the millions who supported him, people they had never met but had already judged. The network loved this kind of thing. It made for great television. Ratings spiked whenever the host took another swing at Trump's base. After all, it was easy. Mocking them was a sport, one where the players never got a chance to fight back. But tonight would be different. Because what the host didn't know, what none of them saw coming, was that someone had been watching. Someone who had spent years being underestimated. Someone who knew exactly how to turn the game around. And in just a few minutes, their laughter would stop, because Donald Trump was about to respond, and the host who had built his career on mocking others, he was about to be left completely, utterly speechless. The host knew exactly what he was doing. He had built his career on it, turning politics into a spectacle, reducing complex issues into quick, viral soundbites designed to humiliate, not to inform. His network thrived on this formula. The more he mocked, the higher the engagement. The angrier his opponents got, the more his supporters cheered. It wasn't just Trump he ridiculed. It was the people who followed him, the working-class Americans who had been abandoned by the very institutions that once claimed to protect them. The factory workers whose jobs had been shipped overseas. The small business owners drowning under regulations written by people who never had to run a business themselves. The farmers who struggled to keep their land while billion-dollar corporations swallowed everything around them. To the host, these people weren't individuals with real struggles. They were caricatures, and his audience? They ate it up. Tonight was just another example. Another monologue filled with carefully curated statistics, selectively edited clips, and the same tired argument that Trump's supporters weren't just wrong, they were ridiculous. "You have to hand it to them," the host continued, still reveling in his audience's laughter. "No matter what happens, they just keep believing. The man literally told them he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose a single vote. And guess what? They still line up like he's their savior." A few cheers, another round of laughter. "They're the kind of people who think fake news is anything they don't like," he added. "Meanwhile, they'll believe anything a billionaire tweets at 3 a.m. This was how the game worked. Find a group of people, strip them of their humanity, reduce them to stereotypes, and then ridicule them for not knowing better. And the best part, they couldn't fight back. The host controlled the narrative. His guests were carefully chosen, only those who would reinforce the show's agenda. If anyone dared to push back too hard, they'd be interrupted, talked over, made to look foolish. And if all else failed, there was always the post-edit. He wasn't worried. This was his domain, his territory. He had done this 1,000 times. He had taken down senators, governors, even CEOs. He had gone head-to-head with some of the most powerful people in the world and walked away victorious because he understood something they didn't. Power wasn't just about influence. It was about perception. If you controlled the way people saw the world, you controlled everything, and tonight he was in complete control, except he wasn't. Because somewhere, on the other side of the country, Donald Trump had been watching. And unlike the carefully selected guests the host was used to humiliating, this was a man who had spent his entire life proving people wrong. The host didn't realize it yet, but he had just made a mistake. He had underestimated the one person who thrived on being underestimated. And the response that was coming? It was about to change everything. For years, they had mocked him, the media, the politicians, the late-night comedians, the elite journalists sitting in their air-conditioned studios, people who had never built anything, never risked anything, never understood the world outside their carefully controlled bubbles. They had called him a joke, a reality TV star playing president, a con man who somehow stumbled into power. They laughed at his words, twisted his statements, painted him as a fool, and yet, every time they thought he was finished, he came back, stronger. Tonight was no different. Another segment, another joke at his expense, another reminder that no matter how much he had accomplished, they would never give him credit, never take him seriously. But Trump didn't care about their approval. He never had. What did get under his skin, what had always gotten under his skin, was the way they mocked his supporters, the way they sneered at the working-class Americans who had put their faith in him, the way they dismissed their struggles, reducing them to punchlines for their wealthy, out-of-touch audiences. They had done it again tonight, and now they thought the segment was over, that they would move on, collect their applause, and carry on with business as usual. But Trump had been watching, and in that moment, something inside him solidified. He had spent decades proving people wrong. He had built skyscrapers when they said he'd fail. He had launched a presidential campaign when they said he had no chance. He had won an election when they laughed at the very idea. And now, once again, they thought they had him cornered. But they were wrong. Because there was one thing they had never understood about Donald Trump. He never lets an insult go unanswered. The host's words played in his head. The smug laughter, the arrogance, the assumption that Trump and his supporters would just sit back and take it. Not tonight. Trump reached for his phone. They wanted a response. They were about to get one. And when it was over, the joke wouldn't be on him. It would be on them. The message went out at exactly 10:37 p.m. Just a single tweet, no preamble, no fluff, just a handful of words, precise and cutting, aimed directly at the heart of the so-called elite who had spent years mocking him. Another out-of-touch liberal TV host pretending to understand real Americans. Maybe he should try stepping outside his studio once in a while. Sad. That was all it took. Within minutes, the response was electric. The tweet spread like wildfire, lighting up screens across the country. Supporters rallied, responding with their own stories, stories of lost jobs, of struggling businesses, of dreams crushed by the very system that people like this host championed. They weren't just words anymore. They were voices, millions of them, speaking back. But that wasn't the real blow, because Trump didn't just send out one tweet. He had something bigger in mind. The host had spent the night reveling in his performance, pleased with himself for another successful segment, another viral moment, another notch in his belt. But when he glanced at his phone and saw Trump's name trending, something changed. At first, he rolled his eyes. Just another Twitter tantrum, he thought. Nothing he hadn't seen before. But as he scrolled, his smirk slowly faded. This wasn't just Trump lashing out. It was something else. Attached to the tweet was a video clip, but not from Trump's team. No, this was something different. A recording from years ago, dug up from the archives, resurfaced at the perfect moment. It showed the host, much younger, fresh in his career, before the fame, before the polished delivery, back when he was hungry, back when he had said things that didn't fit neatly into the persona he now projected. The video played. The biggest problem with the media today, the younger version of the host said, is that it treats working class Americans like they're beneath them. They sneer at people who don't have college degrees. They mock people who live in small towns. And they assume that because someone didn't go to an Ivy League school, their opinion doesn't matter. He had been one of them once, a man who had stood for the very people he now ridiculed, a man who had criticized the very elitism he had since embraced. The hypocrisy was stunning, and Trump had just exposed it. Suddenly, the narrative had shifted. Audience that had laughed along with him just hours ago now had questions. When did he change? Why had he abandoned the people he once claimed to stand for? It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reversal. He had built his career on attacking Trump and his supporters, and now, the very people who had supported him, who had tuned in night after night, were starting to wonder if they had been played. The host scrambled. He had to respond. He had to control the damage. But the more he tried, the worse it got. Every explanation, every excuse was met with more evidence, more clips, more contradictions from his own past. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. The game had changed, and for the first time in his career, the man who had built his empire mocking others was speechless. The fallout was immediate. The segment that had once been a shining moment of mockery was now an anchor pulling the host under. The same media that had laughed along with him the night before was now circling like sharks, sniffing. For blood, headlines flipped overnight. TV host exposed for past statements, caught in blatant hypocrisy. Champion of the left. New video shows hosts past criticisms of elitism. The public loved a takedown story, and this was the perfect one. The very man who had built his brand on sneering at Trump supporters was now exposed as someone who once believed exactly what they did. The network tried to contain the damage. They issued statements. They pushed out positive PR. But it was too late. Clips from the past resurfaced faster than they could bury them. More instances of the host contradicting himself, of him once speaking against the very system he now represented, and the worst part? It wasn't just conservatives calling him out. It was his own audience. The people who had trusted him, who had believed his every word, now saw something they couldn't unsee. They weren't just mad, they were betrayed. The comment sections under his videos, once filled with support, had turned against him. This guy has been lying to us for years. How can we trust anything he says now? I used to respect him, not anymore. Every night, his ratings had been his power, his ability to command an audience, to shape narratives, to control the perception of millions. But now, those numbers started to drop. Sponsors pulled back. The network, once fully behind him, grew quiet. Executives who had once fought to book him in prime slots suddenly weren't returning his calls. And then, just a few weeks later, came the announcement. The host would be taking a break from his show. A carefully worded statement followed. Talks of needing time to reflect, of re-evaluating his approach to political discourse. But everyone knew the truth. He wasn't taking a break. He was being benched. The same system that had propped him up for years had now decided he was a liability. He had become an embarrassment to the very people who once celebrated him. And Donald Trump, he never even had to say another word, because he didn't need to. The host had destroyed himself. Trump had done what he always did. He exposed reality, and let it do the rest. The game had played out exactly as he knew it would. Because in the end, the people who build their empires on mockery and deception always face the same fate. Eventually, the joke is on them.